Welcome to Sleeping Radio, a quiet place where stories unfold slowly and the noise of the day begins to fade. Tonight, we begin a long and gentle journey into a true human tradition, the story of the nomad who seemed to know the future by reading the wind. This is not a story of magic, prophecy, or mystery powers. It is a story of patience, memory, and a deep relationship between human life and nature. For most of human history, the future was not planned with calendars or machines. It was sensed through patterns that repeated themselves across seasons and generations. Among deserts, steppes, and wide open plains, the wind was one of the most important teachers. It carried heat, cold, moisture, dust, and warning. To ignore the wind was to invite loss. To understand it was to survive. This story begins thousands of years ago, long before cities dominated the landscape. It begins with people who lived lightly on the land and moved when the land told them to move. Nomads did not own the earth beneath them, but they listened to it carefully. They learned that the land spoke first, through air. In early human societies, especially in arid regions, survival depended on anticipation rather than reaction. Rain that arrived too late meant death for animals and hunger for families. Nomads learned that the wind often changed before the sky did. A shift in temperature, direction, or smell could signal what the clouds would not yet show. Children grew up watching elders pause, feel the air, and decide. These pauses were lessons. By the first millennium before the Common Era, nomadic cultures across Arabia, North Africa, and Central Asia had developed shared principles of wind reading. These principles were not identical, but they followed the same logic. Early winds mattered more than strong winds. Quiet changes mattered more than storms. A warm wind at the wrong time was more dangerous than a loud one. This knowledge was not written because it was alive and changing. Each region had its own rules, shaped by terrain and history. A wind that meant rain in one desert meant drought in another. The nomad who knew the future was not one man, but a role. It was usually an elder, someone who had lived long enough to compare many cycles. Memory was the true tool. An elder remembered the year when the wind came early and the grass failed. He remembered the year when the wind came late and floods followed. These memories became guidance. They were passed in stories told at night, not as lessons, but as lived experience. As trade expanded between regions, this knowledge became valuable beyond the tribe. Caravans depended on nomads, not only for routes, but for timing. A road that was safe one week could be deadly the next. Nomads knew this because the wind told them. Historical sources from the ancient world mention guides who refused to travel despite clear skies. Days later, travelers would encounter heat, sand, or emptiness where water once was. To outsiders, this seemed like foresight. To the nomad, it was simply listening. In the Arabian Peninsula, before the rise of Islam, poetry preserved environmental knowledge. Winds were described as merciful or cruel, not as myth, but as memory. A northern wind meant endurance. A southern wind at the wrong season meant danger. These were not metaphors. They were warnings disguised as art. In Central Asia, steppe nomads watched how wind moved grass. If grass bent low and stayed low, the soil beneath was weakening. Animals would struggle soon. This allowed herders to move before loss became visible. The future did not arrive suddenly. It arrived quietly, carried by air. The nomad who knew the future never claimed to control fate. He accepted uncertainty but reduced surprise. He acted earlier than others because he noticed earlier than others. This made his decisions seem prophetic. In reality, they were preventative. As centuries passed, empires rose and fell, but this knowledge remained. Persian, Roman, and later Islamic sources all mention desert peoples whose movements seemed perfectly timed. Scholars like Al-Jahez and later Al-Masudi wrote about environmental awareness among nomads. They did not describe magic, they described attention. By the medieval period, Ibn Khaldun explained that constant exposure to nature sharpened perception. He argued that living close to hardship produced clarity of judgment. Wind patterns, in this view, were signals of social and economic change. Scarcity followed environmental instability. Movement followed scarcity. Conflict followed movement. Nomads sensed the beginning of this chain long before its end. The nomad who knew the future was often the first to suggest storing water. He advised moving camp earlier than usual. He reduced herd size before grass disappeared. These choices were unpopular at first. Later, they saved lives. European travelers crossing deserts in the later medieval and early modern periods recorded similar impressions. They wrote of guides who refused routes without explanation. These guides were rarely wrong. They did not celebrate accuracy. They simply continued. As modern science developed, some of this knowledge was dismissed as instinct, yet meteorology later confirmed many of these observations. Temperature shifts, pressure changes, and humidity patterns aligned with traditional wind reading. The difference was tools, not truth. Nomads used bodies and memory. Scientists used instruments and data. Both observed the same sky. As the modern world accelerated, this ancient wisdom faded from daily life, but it never disappeared completely. In remote regions, elders still teach children to feel the air at dawn. They still listen at night. They still trust the wind more than distant forecasts. The future still arrives first as a change in atmosphere. As generations passed, the landscape itself became a living archive of memory. Every ridge held a lesson. Every dry riverbed carried a reminder of what had once been. Nomads did not see emptiness where others saw desert. They saw traces of earlier years written into sand and stone. A wind that carved a dune differently than before meant the season had shifted. A wind that returned too often from one direction meant imbalance. These signs were subtle, and only repetition made them clear. A single year taught nothing, but 20 years taught patterns. The nomad who knew the future was often quiet, not because he lacked words, but because he measured them. Speaking to early caused panic. Speaking to late caused loss. So he learned to speak only when change was certain. This restraint became part of his reputation. People trusted him because he did not warn often. When he did, they listened. In times of abundance, his advice sounded excessive. In times of scarcity, it sounded wise. Nomadic societies valued memory more than speed. A fast decision based on incomplete signs could destroy a season. A slow decision based on accumulated knowledge could save a generation. This rhythm shaped daily life. Morning was for observation. Midday was for movement. Evening was for memory. At night, elders spoke quietly about years long past. They did not frame these stories as history. They framed them as preparation. By the time a child grew old enough to lead, the wind already felt familiar. It felt like an old companion rather than a threat. This familiarity reduced fear. Fear clouds judgment. Calm sharpens it. The nomad who knew the future was calm because he trusted the process. He knew that nature rarely surprised those who paid attention. Surprise belonged to those who ignored small signs and waited for dramatic ones. Empires often fell into this trap. They reacted to crises instead of anticipating them. Nomads anticipated because reaction came too late in open land. There were no walls to hide behind. Only timing offered protection. As centuries moved on, this knowledge adapted to new pressures. When political borders hardened, nomads adjusted routes rather than resist directly. A shift in wind that reduced pasture also reduced safety. Movement became both ecological and political. Wind no longer predicted only weather, but risk. When seasonal winds aligned poorly with traditional grazing routes, it often meant tension ahead. Scarcity pushed groups closer together. Closeness increased conflict. The nomad who read the wind could sense this chain early. He advised moving farther, not out of fear, but foresight. To outsiders, this looked like avoidance. In reality, it was preservation. During long drought cycles, recorded later by historians, nomadic movements aligned closely with climatic shifts. These movements were not random migrations. They were calculated responses to environmental signals. The wind carried the first notice. Long before wells dried, the air grew thin. Long before grass vanished, dust rose differently. Long before famine was named, hunger was felt in the wind. This sensitivity created resilience. Nomadic societies survived repeated collapses that destroyed settled communities. They lost much, but rarely everything. Their flexibility was rooted in listening. The future did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded gradually, one signal at a time. The nomad who knew the future understood this rhythm deeply. He did not wait for certainty. He acted on likelihood. Likelihood, repeated often enough, became wisdom. As the modern era approached, this way of knowing began to fade from prominence. Written forecasts replaced lived observation. Numbers replaced senses. Yet, even then, when instruments failed, people returned to older knowledge. Sailors watched flags. Farmers smelled rain. Shepherds listened at night. These habits survived because they worked. The wind remained consistent even as society changed. It still shifted before storms. It still warmed before drought. It still warmed before hardship. The difference was attention. The nomad paid attention because his life depended on it. Others could afford distraction, and so the story continues, not as a legend, but as a reminder. The future is rarely hidden, it is simply quiet. As knowledge deepened, nomadic observation became more structured, even without writing. Specific winds were linked to specific outcomes through long experience rather than belief. A dry western wind in early spring meant delayed pasture growth. A steady eastern wind at night meant stable temperatures for several weeks. These associations were tested repeatedly, and those that failed were abandoned. Only what worked survived. This process created an unwritten system refined over centuries. Each generation inherited conclusions rather than guesses. Decision-making followed this system closely. When wind patterns contradicted tradition, movement was delayed rather than forced. Nomads preferred waiting to acting on uncertain signs. This patience prevented catastrophic mistakes. In caravan travel, timing was more valuable than speed. Merchants learned that arriving early to a hostile season caused greater loss than arriving late. Nomads advised caravans to remain idle when wind patterns indicated instability. These pauses saved lives, though they cost time. Historical trade records note seasonal delays without explanation. Wind was the explanation. In military history, nomadic groups often avoided battle by moving before supply shortages became visible. This created the illusion of strategic foresight. In truth, it was environmental awareness. When winds disrupted normal grazing cycles, warriors stayed close to resources instead of pursuing expansion. This restraint preserved strength. By the early Islamic period, written scholarship began absorbing this practical knowledge. Geographers described prevailing winds and seasonal shifts based on reports from nomads. These descriptions were empirical rather than symbolic. Wind, direction, duration, and temperature were noted carefully. The goal was navigation, not philosophy. Over time, this information entered sailing manuals and agricultural calendars, yet the original source remained unnamed. Nomadic contribution was absorbed quietly. As urban societies expanded, they depended indirectly on this knowledge, while dismissing its origin. Wind reading became classified as experience rather than science. Still, when conditions became extreme, experience proved more reliable than theory. During prolonged droughts recorded in medieval chronicles, nomadic movement preceded urban shortages by months. Cities reacted when grain failed. Nomads reacted when air changed. This difference in response time shaped survival outcomes. Some communities recovered quickly because they had already adjusted. Others collapsed because they waited for certainty. The nomad who knew the future understood uncertainty as permanent. He worked within it rather than against it. Preparation replaced prediction. Flexibility replaced control. This mindset extended beyond weather. It influenced social organization and leadership. Leaders were chosen for judgment rather than authority. Those who ignored signs lost trust. Those who listened retained it. This created accountability based on outcomes rather than promises. As external pressures increased, this system remained effective. It allowed adaptation without chaos. By the time modern instruments confirmed many of these observations, nomadic societies had already practiced them for generations. Science did not replace this knowledge, it explained it. Today, fragments of this system still exist in rural practices. People adjust routines based on wind without consciously naming the reason. These habits are remnants of a longer memory. They remind us that careful attention once guided entire societies. The nomad who seemed to know the future never claimed certainty. He relied on consistency, and consistency, observed long enough, became guidance rather than guesswork. As trade networks expanded further, nomads became silent regulators of regional stability. Their movements affected supply lines, market timing, and the survival of distant towns. When wind patterns indicated a poor season ahead, nomads reduced participation in trade early. This withdrawal limited losses before scarcity reached cities. Urban merchants often noticed shortages without understanding the cause. The cause had already passed through the desert weeks earlier. In some regions, entire markets shifted dates based on nomadic arrival patterns. When nomads arrived early, abundance followed. When they arrived late, caution spread. This indirect influence made nomads essential without making them visible. They shaped outcomes without issuing orders. Their authority came from accuracy. Among steppe societies, wind observation also guided breeding cycles. Herd reproduction was timed according to expected pasture quality. A misjudged season could weaken animals for years. Wind behavior before winter determined whether herds expanded or contracted. This long planning horizon created stability across generations. Short-term gain was sacrificed for continuity. In contrast, settled societies often planned only until the next harvest. This difference widened during periods of environmental stress. Nomadic groups adjusted faster because they planned further ahead. Wind patterns provided early indicators unavailable to stationary observers. In some historical droughts, nomads moved out of affected regions before damage became irreversible. Those who remained behind faced scarcity without preparation. This reinforced the belief that nomads knew what others did not. In reality, they noticed what others could not afford to notice. Attention required time and exposure. Nomads had both. As political authorities attempted to control movement, wind knowledge became more discreet. Routes changed quietly rather than openly. Camps shifted at night rather than day. Observation continued, but explanations stopped. Nomads learned that knowledge protected only when shared carefully. Silence became another survival skill. Written records from later periods mention sudden absences of entire groups. Administrators described this as unpredictability. It was actually response. The wind had already delivered its message. During prolonged cold cycles, wind chill mattered more than temperature. Nomads adjusted clothing, shelter orientation, and travel hours accordingly. Shelters were placed to deflect prevailing winds rather than face scenery. These choices reduced illness and loss. Such details rarely entered chronicles. They were too ordinary to record, yet they preserved lives more reliably than grand strategies. The nomad who knew the future did not look beyond the horizon. He focused on the immediate signals that shaped the next decision. Large outcomes were built from small corrections. This approach avoided dramatic failure. It favored endurance over dominance. When new technologies appeared, some nomads adopted them cautiously. Tools were tested against experience, not accepted blindly. If a tool aligned with observed patterns, it remained. If it contradicted them, it was discarded. This selective adoption preserved core knowledge. Even modern forecasts were compared against wind felt directly. Trust was earned, not assumed. Over time, this balance allowed adaptation without dependence. Nomadic societies remained flexible because they never surrendered observation. The wind remained the first reference point. It provided local truth in a changing world. As this long story continues, its meaning becomes clearer. The nomad did not know the future as a fixed outcome. He understood direction rather than destination. Direction was enough to act. That was his advantage. As the centuries layered upon one another, wind knowledge began to shape identity as much as survival. Nomads did not describe themselves by borders or ancestry alone, but by the lands and air they understood. Knowing a region meant knowing how its wind behaved across time. This knowledge separated locals from strangers more clearly than language. A traveler could imitate dress and speech, but not judgment. Judgment came only from long exposure. In this way, wind reading became a marker of belonging. Those who misread it revealed themselves quickly. Among nomadic councils, decisions were rarely rushed. Discussion followed observation rather than opinion. When elders disagreed, they waited. Time itself became a tool for clarity. If the wind remained consistent, agreement followed. If it shifted again, plans changed. This patience prevented irreversible choices. It also frustrated outsiders who demanded immediate answers. Nomads accepted delay as wisdom. They understood that acting too soon was more dangerous than acting late. Wind patterns reinforced this belief repeatedly. A sudden change often corrected itself. A sustained change never did. Learning to tell the difference mattered more than speed. This distinction guided movement, trade, and social bonds. Marriage alliances shifted based on expected seasons. A harsh year reduced expansion. A stable cycle encouraged growth. Wind influenced these expectations silently. It shaped family decisions without being named. Children were born into rhythms already established. Their lives followed patterns older than memory. As religious traditions spread, wind knowledge adapted without conflict. It did not challenge belief, it supported survival. Faith addressed meaning, wind addressed timing. Both coexisted without contradiction. Nomads prayed for rain, but they moved before drought. This balance avoided dependence on hope alone. It grounded expectation in observation. During periods of widespread instability, wind knowledge became especially valuable. When climates fluctuated rapidly, old calendars failed, nomads relied instead on immediate signals. These signals updated faster than any written system. This responsiveness allowed continuity through uncertainty. While others struggled to interpret change, nomads responded naturally. They did not ask why conditions shifted. They asked what to do next. This practical focus preserved resources. It also preserved morale. Confidence came from preparedness, not optimism. The nomad who knew the future never promised ease. He promised readiness. Readiness reduced fear. Fear caused mistakes. This understanding shaped leadership deeply. Leaders who ignored environmental signs lost authority quickly. Their decisions failed visibly. Leaders who listened retained trust. Outcomes validated judgment more than words. This accountability strengthened community cohesion. Over time, stories formed around individuals who consistently made the right call. These stories grew larger than life. Accuracy became legend. Legend became reputation. Reputation attracted followers. Thus, the image of the nomad who knew the future emerged. Not from exaggeration, but from repeated reliability. Reliability over time feels like foresight. In truth, it is consistency rewarded. As modern infrastructure spread, this kind of knowledge lost public recognition. Yet it remained active in private decision-making. Farmers adjusted planting by feel. Herders adjusted movement by air. Fishermen delayed departure based on smell and sound. These actions rarely entered records. They did not need explanation. They worked. Today, scientific language describes phenomena nomads understood intuitively. Pressure systems, humidity gradients, thermal shifts. Different words for the same experience. The difference lies in method, not insight. Nomads used bodies as instruments. Science uses machines. Both respond to patterns. The nomad trusted what repeated. Repetition built confidence. Confidence guided action. As this long journey continues, the story remains open. Because it is not a story of one life, but of many. It has no single ending. It continues wherever people still listen. The wind has not changed. Only the attention given to it has. As environments grew more complex, nomadic knowledge expanded to include combinations rather than single signs. Wind alone was never read in isolation. It was weighed alongside temperature, cloud height, animal behavior, and soil response. A favorable wind, paired with restless animals, suggested instability rather than safety. A harsh wind paired with calm herds suggested endurance rather than danger. These layered readings reduced error. They also required discipline. Nomads learned not to trust a single signal, no matter how familiar. They waited for alignment. Alignment meant reliability. This approach contrasted sharply with settled decision-making, which often relied on fixed dates. Calendars assumed consistency. Nomadic observation expected variation. When calendars failed, observation prevailed. During years when seasonal cycles broke down, nomads adapted while others struggled to understand why. This adaptability shaped long-term survival. It also shaped worldview. The future was seen as fluid, not fixed. Preparation replaced prediction. This distinction mattered deeply. Predicting invited disappointment. Preparing invited resilience. The nomad who knew the future never claimed certainty. He offered probability. Probability was enough to act. This mindset filtered into everyday choices. Shelters were oriented based on prevailing wind shifts rather than tradition. Travel began earlier or later, depending on air density rather than sunrise alone. Rest periods changed with atmospheric pressure rather than fatigue. These adjustments improved efficiency quietly. They reduced strain on bodies and animals. Over years, small efficiencies accumulated into survival advantage. Nomads rarely spoke about these details explicitly. Explanation was unnecessary within the community. Understanding was shared through practice. New members learned by watching, not by instruction. Correction came through consequence. Mistakes taught faster than lectures. This learning style reinforced attentiveness. Everyone became an observer. The elder guided, but the group watched together. Collective observation reduced dependence on a single voice. This distributed awareness prevented collapse if one leader failed. It also ensured continuity. Knowledge did not die with individuals. It lived in habits. As pressures increased from expanding states, nomads adjusted without confrontation. They altered timing rather than territory. Movement became less predictable to outsiders but more precise internally. This precision protected autonomy. States struggled to regulate what they could not measure. Wind-guided routes beyond administrative reach. This invisibility preserved independence longer than force ever could. When conflicts did occur, nomads avoided prolonged engagement. They disengaged when wind signaled supply risk. They returned when conditions stabilized. This strategy reduced attrition. It favored survival over victory. Victory required resources. Survival required timing. Wind provided timing. As written history advanced, many of these practices were simplified or misinterpreted. Chroniclers described nomads as wandering without plan. They mistook flexibility for randomness. They saw movement but not reason. The reason was already gone, carried away by air weeks earlier. Modern research into climate history later revealed patterns aligning with nomadic movement. Periods of cooling, warming, or instability corresponded with shifts recorded in oral memory. Science confirmed what experience had preserved. This confirmation did not change practice. Nomads had never needed validation. They needed results. Results had sustained them. In the present day, fragments of this knowledge remain embedded in language. Phrases about bad winds or false breezes survive without explanation. They are echoes of earlier understanding. People repeat them without remembering origin. The origin lies in lived observation. As technology advances, reliance on external systems increases, yet those systems still depend on local data. Local data still begins with air. Wind remains the first indicator. It announces change before instruments register it. The difference lies in attention. Attention requires slowing down. Nomadic life enforced slowness. Modern life resists it. This resistance explains why ancient knowledge feels distant. It is not obsolete. It is quiet. The nomad who knew the future did not rush to hear it. He waited. Waiting revealed patterns. Patterns revealed direction. Direction guided action. This chain sustained life across centuries. It did so without spectacle, without authority, without record, only through consistency. As this long telling continues, it remains faithful to that spirit. The story moves slowly because understanding always did. As time moved forward, nomadic knowledge became increasingly refined through correction and adjustment. When an expectation failed, it was not defended, it was revised. This willingness to discard error prevented tradition from becoming rigid. What mattered was outcome, not pride. A wind rule that no longer matched reality was quietly abandoned. Another replaced it based on new experience. This constant revision kept knowledge aligned with a changing climate. Nomads understood that nature does not owe consistency. They adapted without nostalgia. The past was a reference, not a command. This attitude reduced conflict between generations. Elders taught principles, not fixed instructions. Younger members learned how to observe rather than what to expect. This ensured continuity even as conditions shifted. In this way, wind reading became a skill rather than a doctrine. Skills evolve, doctrines resist. Evolution ensured survival. Resistance invited loss. The nomad who knew the future was therefore not bound to certainty. He was bound to awareness. Awareness required humility before complexity. Complexity demanded patience. Patience allowed clarity. Clarity guided timing. Timing preserved life. This chain repeated itself endlessly across landscapes and centuries. No single moment defined it. Only accumulation did. As environments altered gradually, this method absorbed change naturally. There was no shock because adaptation was continuous. Other societies experienced collapse when systems failed abruptly. Nomads experienced adjustment instead. Adjustment felt ordinary. Ordinary endurance rarely attracts attention. Yet endurance shapes history more than spectacle. The future rarely arrives as a single event. It unfolds through small shifts. The nomad noticed these shifts because he lived within them. He did not observe from a distance. Distance dulls perception. Proximity sharpens it. As years turned into decades and decades into centuries, the accumulated knowledge of wind patterns became one of the most stable forms of intelligence in nomadic life, because it was tested daily against reality and corrected without ceremony whenever it failed. This made it stronger than rigid systems, since it accepted uncertainty as natural and treated change not as a threat but as information. Nomads learned early that nature does not repeat itself exactly, yet it echoes itself closely enough for those who pay attention over long periods. From this understanding came an ability to anticipate not events themselves, but the conditions that made events likely. A season of unstable winds often preceded a season of unstable movement among people, because land that could not sustain animals could not sustain peace. Thus, environmental awareness slowly turned into social awareness without any deliberate theory behind it. When wind patterns suggested scarcity, nomads adjusted behavior quietly, reducing travel, limiting trade, and conserving energy long before fear spread among settled populations. By the time shortages became visible in markets and cities, nomads had already reshaped their lives around the coming reality. This difference in timing created the impression that nomads lived ahead of the present moment, when in truth they simply responded earlier to the same signals others ignored. The future, for them, was not distant. It was already forming in the air around them. Such awareness required constant presence, because distraction dulled the senses that this knowledge depended upon. Nomadic life, by necessity, removed many distractions and replaced them with attentiveness as a daily habit. There was little separation between living and observing, because survival demanded that both happen at once. Every movement was also a measurement, and every pause was also an evaluation. Wind reading influenced not only large decisions like migration, but also small ones like when to repair, shelter, or how to position animals at night. These small decisions accumulated into resilience, that outsiders rarely noticed or recorded. As generations passed, individuals who consistently made the right adjustments earned deep trust, and their advice carried weight without needing authority or force. This trust did not come from charisma, but from outcomes remembered across many seasons. Stories formed around these individuals, slowly exaggerating their abilities as memory compressed time. What had once been careful observation became, in retelling, foresight. Thus, the idea of the nomad who knew the future emerged not from invention, but from repeated reliability stretched across generations. Accuracy remembered long enough begins to resemble prophecy. Yet within the community, these individuals were not seen as special, only experienced. Their value lay in restraint rather than boldness, because bold decisions based on weak signs had ruined families before. Over time, this culture of caution shaped collective behavior, reducing risk without eliminating movement. Nomads did not freeze in fear of uncertainty, they learned to move within it. This balance allowed them to survive climatic fluctuations that overwhelmed more rigid systems. Where fixed schedules collapsed, flexible timing endured. As empires rose, expanded, and fell, nomads continued to outlast political change because their reference point was not power, but environment. Wind patterns ignored borders, and so did the people who followed them. Attempts to control nomadic movement often failed because authorities tried to regulate space rather than timing. Timing remained invisible to those who did not live within it. Wind delivered information freely, but only to those trained to notice. This training was lifelong and unending, because stopping meant forgetting. In later centuries, when scientific instruments began to explain atmospheric behavior in formal language, many of these traditional observations found confirmation. Pressure systems, thermal gradients, and humidity shifts described mathematically mirrored what nomads had felt physically for centuries. This did not diminish their knowledge, it translated it. Different languages described the same reality. The nomad who knew the future was therefore never separated from truth, only from terminology. His understanding came from proximity rather than abstraction. Even today, in places where people still live close to land and animals, echoes of this awareness remain active. People adjust plans without naming the reason, guided by sensation rather than calculation. These habits survive because they continue to work, even when their origins are forgotten. They are cultural memory embedded in behavior rather than words. As this long story continues toward its conclusion, one truth becomes clear without needing emphasis. The future has always announced itself softly before arriving loudly. As this way of living continued across centuries, nomads became experts not only in reading wind but in managing uncertainty itself. Because wind never offered certainty, only likelihood shaped by repetition and memory. Living with likelihood trained them to act without waiting for absolute confirmation, a habit that allowed survival where hesitation would have been fatal. They understood that waiting for proof often meant waiting too long, since proof usually arrived together with damage. Instead, they learned to act when enough signs aligned to suggest risk, even if comfort still existed in the present moment. This discipline required emotional control as much as observation, because moving early meant leaving behind resources that still appeared usable. Trusting the wind meant trusting judgment over visible abundance. Families learned to dismantle camps while grass was still green, because green grass could vanish faster than memory if the air had already changed. This behavior confused outsiders who equated visible resources with safety. Nomads learned that visibility lagged behind reality. Reality announced itself first through pressure, heat, and movement of air. Over time, this understanding shaped how nomads related to loss. Loss was not seen as punishment, but as information that had been missed or misread. This perspective reduced blame and increased learning. When animals died or routes failed, the question was not who caused it, but which sign had been ignored. This attitude strengthened collective responsibility rather than fear. Everyone was accountable for paying attention. Attention became a shared duty rather than an individual talent. Children were corrected gently when they ignored signs, not punished harshly. Harsh punishment discouraged curiosity, while curiosity sustained awareness. This educational approach preserved sensitivity across generations. Sensitivity was treated as strength, not weakness. In harsh environments, emotional numbness reduced perception. Perception required openness. Nomads remained open because survival demanded it. As climates shifted gradually over long periods, this openness allowed adjustment without collapse. There was no single breaking point, only continuous recalibration. Other societies recorded disasters as sudden events, while nomads experienced them as processes already underway. This difference in experience shaped memory. Nomads remembered transition rather than catastrophe. This made fear less dominant and preparation more central. Preparation replaced hope as the main response to uncertainty. Hope alone could not move camps or feed animals. Preparation could. As written history focused on rulers and wars, this quiet intelligence remained largely invisible. Historians recorded outcomes, but rarely the environmental decisions that shaped them. Yet many military failures and economic collapses followed environmental signals that nomads had already responded to. Their movements left no monuments, only absence. Absence was misinterpreted as unpredictability rather than foresight. What was unseen was not understood. As communication between cultures increased, some scholars began to recognize patterns linking nomadic movement to environmental change. These observations appeared scattered across texts without forming a single theory. The theory already existed in practice. Practice did not require explanation to function. Nomads continued to rely on lived calibration rather than abstraction. Abstraction belonged to those who could afford distance from consequence. Distance reduced urgency. Urgency sharpened awareness. Nomadic life sustained urgency without panic. Panic destroyed judgment. Judgment sustained life. The nomad who knew the future was therefore not extraordinary by nature, but ordinary within an extraordinary discipline of attention. What seemed rare from the outside was common within the culture. This cultural normalization of awareness prevented dependence on singular figures. Knowledge was distributed rather than concentrated. This distribution protected communities from collapse when individuals were lost. It also allowed gradual refinement across generations. No single person carried the entire system. Everyone carried part of it. As modern life continues to accelerate, this mode of knowing feels increasingly distant, yet it remains relevant wherever conditions remain uncertain and stakes remain high. The wind still changes before systems fail. The question is no longer whether the wind speaks. The question is who still listens long enough to understand what it says. As the practice continued to mature, nomadic understanding of wind expanded beyond immediate survival and began to influence long-term planning across generations, shaping where families expected their descendants to live rather than where they themselves were comfortable. A route chosen today was judged not only by present conditions, but by whether it would remain viable if the same wind patterns repeated years later. This long-horizon thinking distinguished nomadic strategy from short-lived adaptation, because it assumed that patterns would return even if timing shifted. By accepting recurrence without expecting precision, nomads prepared for futures they would never personally witness. Wind knowledge, therefore, became a form of inheritance more valuable than objects, because it could not be stolen, taxed, or destroyed by conquest. Even when camps were lost and herds diminished, the understanding remained intact as long as memory survived. This made nomadic societies unusually resilient to external shocks, because loss of material wealth did not erase decision-making capacity. Recovery began immediately after loss, guided by the same environmental awareness that had once provided abundance. In contrast, societies dependent on fixed infrastructure suffered deeper collapse when systems failed, because rebuilding required time that scarcity did not allow. Nomads rebuilt through movement rather than construction, and movement required timing rather than resources. Wind delivered timing freely, but only to those who maintained sensitivity. Sensitivity, therefore, became the most protected asset within the culture. As populations grew and landscapes experienced pressure, nomads adjusted herd sizes based on projected pasture cycles rather than immediate gain. This restraint prevented irreversible damage to land, preserving future capacity at the cost of present expansion. Such decisions appeared conservative to outsiders who measured success by accumulation. Nomads measured success by continuity. Continuity required sacrifice, and sacrifice required confidence in unseen outcomes. Wind patterns provided that confidence because they had proven reliable across many cycles. The relationship between wind and trust deepened accordingly, creating an internal logic that did not depend on persuasion or authority. When elders spoke, they rarely justified their advice, because justification weakened confidence if conditions later shifted. Instead, they framed decisions as responses rather than predictions. Response allowed revision, while prediction invited judgment. This linguistic choice mattered because it preserved flexibility without undermining trust. If conditions changed, adjustment was expected rather than seen as failure. This expectation reduced internal conflict during uncertain periods. As a result, nomadic groups maintained cohesion even when outcomes were unfavorable. They did not fracture under disappointment because disappointment had already been accounted for. The wind did not promise success, only information. Information guided behavior without guaranteeing comfort. This realism grounded nomadic culture in acceptance rather than illusion. Acceptance reduced panic, and reduced panic improved decision quality. As environmental pressures increased during periods of regional climate instability, this mindset became increasingly valuable. Communities that clung to certainty suffered abrupt breakdown, while those accustomed to uncertainty absorbed shock gradually. Nomads experienced hardship as fluctuation rather than collapse. Fluctuation could be managed through movement, rationing, and patience. Patience was not passive waiting, but active monitoring of conditions. Monitoring kept options open. Throughout history, this approach allowed nomads to outlast empires that relied on rigid planning. When centralized systems failed, nomadic systems reconfigured themselves quietly. Their success did not appear dramatic because it avoided catastrophe rather than overcoming it. Avoidance rarely earns recognition, yet it preserves life more reliably than heroism. This is why the nomad who knew the future left few traces in official history. His victories were invisible because they prevented disaster rather than responding to it. As this long account continues, the pattern remains consistent and grounded in truth. The future was never guessed. It was approached carefully, step by step, carried on the wind. As the long arc of this tradition reaches its quiet end, it becomes clear that what appeared to outsiders as foresight was in fact a disciplined way of living with uncertainty, shaped by attention, memory, and restraint rather than mystery or chance. The nomad who knew the future by wind patterns never claimed to see events before they happened, but he understood how conditions formed and how small changes accumulated into large consequences over time. This understanding allowed him to act earlier, not because he was certain, but because he was aware that waiting for certainty usually meant waiting too long. In this way, the future was never a distant horizon. It was already unfolding in the present through air, pressure, heat, and movement. Across centuries, this approach protected families, herds, and communities without leaving monuments or written records, because its success lay in what did not happen rather than what did. Disasters were avoided, losses were reduced, and recovery began before collapse became visible. What history remembers as sudden famine, migration, or conflict often began as subtle environmental shifts that nomads had already responded to quietly. Their absence from danger zones was mistaken for unpredictability, when it was in fact preparation completed ahead of time. This way of knowing demanded humility, because it accepted that no one controlled nature and no sign guaranteed safety. It demanded patience, because acting too quickly on incomplete signals could be as harmful as acting too late. It demanded memory, because patterns only revealed themselves to those who remembered many seasons at once. And it demanded calm, because fear distorted perception and rushed judgment. These qualities shaped a culture where readiness mattered more than reassurance and adjustment mattered more than pride. Leaders were trusted not for promises, but for outcomes that aligned repeatedly with reality. Children learned not through instruction alone, but through living inside a rhythm where observation was constant and correction was gentle. Mistakes became lessons rather than shame, because survival depended on learning rather than blame. As the modern world grew louder and faster, this quiet intelligence faded from public awareness, but not from relevance. Wind still changes before systems fail, climates still shift before economies respond, and instability still announces itself subtly before becoming visible. The difference today is not in the signals themselves, but in the attention given to them. Most people no longer live close enough to consequence to notice early change, while those who do still adjust quietly without explanation. In that sense, the nomad who knew the future has never disappeared. He has simply become less visible. He exists wherever people still slow down enough to notice, still trust patterns over noise, and still act before comfort turns into risk. And now tell me, what do you think about the nomad who seemed to know the future by reading the wind? Do you see this as lost wisdom or as knowledge that still survives quietly in the modern world? If you found calm and meaning in this long journey, do not forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. And thank you for watching and listening with Sleeping Radio.